Welcome to the Roman Rite with Brian Newberry, where Christ is King and Rome is home. It is April 8th, 2026, and tonight we are going to be talking about what is the best form of government. But before that, I've got to have a little commercial here. Don't forget to pick up my latest book on Amazon, The Men in White, The Ultimate Catholic Controversy, Volume 2, Brian Newberry, S. Clark. Get it on Amazon. You will not be disappointed. If you watched the video series we did, a 4-part series on John the 23rd, you get an idea of what the book is about. We write 6 short biographies of the first 6 claimants to the papacy after the death of Pope Pius XII, whom we who hold to the sedevacantist position believe is the last legitimate Catholic pope. And that beginning with John the 23rd in 1958 to the present day, all of the claimants are usurpers, non-Catholics who are actually advocating a non-Catholic religion, what we call the Novus Ordo religion of Vatican II, a religion that on the outside appears to be the Catholic religion, but actually is not. It is a hybrid religion, Catholicism mixed with Protestantism, a little bit of Judaism, and even some local religions depending on the social setting. For example, the Pachamama incident, right? So it's very, it absorbs virtually any religion without subordinating it and placing it under Christ's feet, which in times past, the Catholic Church would Christianize pagan religions, subdue them, conquer them, if you will, in the name of Christ, and take that which is good of those religions, and then discarding all of the paganism and idolatrous parts. Whereas the Novus Ordo religion does not seek to convert pagans as much, or they might even consider it proselytism if you try to convince them of the Catholic faith being the only true faith. So they want to dialogue with them and kind of share ideas and take what they can from those religions and incorporate it into the Novus Ordo and even into the Mass, using enculturation, right? So all of that as an aside, let's get back to what we were going to talk about, which is politics, namely, what is the best form of government according to Catholic teaching? And I'll give you a hint. It isn't republicanism. It isn't democracy, right? You might get a little hint of what the best form of government is. Yes, it is monarchy, right? If you're a red-blooded American, that might make you cringe because as Americans, we are kind of trained from birth to kind of cringe at any type of authoritarian form of government, right? After all, America was founded as a revolt against monarchy, right? King George III of England, right? Kind of breaking the shackles, freeing ourselves from the tyranny of the British monarchy. Ironically, though, out of all the British monarchs, all the Protestant British monarchs, George III was probably the most traditionally oriented, being a member of the Tory party, whereas the Whig parties were considered very anti-monarchical and liberal at the time, radically even. So, yeah, America has always been kind of anti-monarchy, anti-authoritarian, even though, after the defeat of the British, some people did want to make George Washington the King of America, and he refused the title because that would be counter to, their ideology at the time. But Catholicism itself is a monarchy, right? The Pope is literally the monarch of Vatican City, but, in the ecclesiastical governance, he is the chief of the apostles, the bishop of bishops, so he is the monarch. And if we just think about it naturally, though, in nature, hierarchy is normal and natural, right? And you can see this, one of the big television genres that we have today would be the apocalyptic genre, right? So, for example, The Walking Dead was a big hit, right? So what happens when it hits the fan and everything kind of goes to crap, right? What happens naturally is people form tribes or communities, you could say, and they emerge under the leadership of one person, usually a man, right? That's what comes natural. Although in the show you'll have some female leaders, in the later seasons, but most effectively, it is the leadership of either one man or a small group of men who kind of lead the community, right? And that's according to nature, right? That's the most natural form of government. I mean, look at the history of humanity, right? Monarchy is by far, in all of its forms, by far the most common form of government because it is natural, right? And if you think about it, in the Catholic religion, Jesus Christ is a king, right? And when we say the Lord's Prayer, the Pater Noster, we pray, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, right? So God the Father is also a king. In the Old Testament, Yahweh was the king of Israel, even though they might also have had an earthly king during most of their history. But we pray to the Father, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. It isn't thy kingdom in heaven only, and on earth we have a republic or a democracy. No, that's naturally. And let's just think about some of the advantages of monarchy in, vis-a-vis, modern Western forms of government, right? With a monarchy, you do not have gridlock, right? So in America, you have two main political parties. In the European countries, you'll have, more than two. But in America, you'll have two competing political parties who are always arguing, don't agree on very much at all, at least in theory. And, there's always like this gridlock. So a lot does not get done. And in a way, America, the founders of America kind of designed it that way. They didn't want, radical revolutionary change. So how do you prevent that? You have a balance of powers, checks and balances, and you have a lot of slow gridlock, right? So a lot of voting, a lot of filibustering, a lot of, I don't want to say underhandedness, bribery or anything, but we know that it happens with lobbying and everything else. So a lot of, a lot of skullduggery, in political ways. So, things don't happen very quickly. A lot of times in a negative sense, things don't get done that ought to be done, right? So a monarchy, on the other hand, although a king might have several advisors, he might have, a court of nobles who specialize in, particular areas like war or, diplomacy, and so forth. Ultimately, what the king says goes, right? And even in forms of constitutional monarchies, the king is still the chief executor. So, he doesn't have to go through any formality like signing an executive order. He could just make the decree, and that's that. So things can happen very quickly, and in good and bad ways. In the negative sense, if you have a bad king can be overthrown a lot easier and quickly than if you have a bad republic or a bad democracy, right? Bad republics and bad democracies require civil war to overturn. Whereas if you have a bad monarch, it does not require necessarily a civil war to throw out the bad monarch. There's just a revolt, and sometimes the nobles themselves will overthrow the monarch, and that's that, right? So, of course, the ecclesiastical monarchy of the Catholic Church, that doesn't happen because the Pope, when we actually have a Pope, does not get overturned by the cardinals, at least not formally or legitimately, right? They can kind of plot in various ways, but and popes don't generally resign. I think we've had, if you count Benedict XVI's resignation, that would assume he was actually a pope. I think was there one other resignation in history? And then you also have anti-popes, people who claim to be popes throughout history, while another person was the legitimate pope, right? So that's another, you have these, in the civil sphere, a bad monarch can be overthrown. If you get a bad pope, which, throughout the history of the Catholic Church, there hasn't been that many like wicked popes, maybe a handful. Most of them have been virtuous, to say the least. They might engage in political intrigue from time to time. Sometimes that's just necessary. And then, in the early centuries, almost every pope was a saint, a canonized saint. So it's a little bit different in the ecclesiastical way of the Catholic Church, but I digress. We're not talking particularly about the ecclesiastical monarchy of the Catholic Church, the papacy, although we will be reading from St. Robert Bellarmine's book called On the Roman Pontiff. Now, St. Robert Bellarmine is a doctor of the Church, so that means his theological opinion is of the highest esteem, and he's writing in the 16th century after the Protestant Revolution, and what he's doing is he is depending the theology of the papacy, the dogma of the papacy, against the Protestants who were critical of the papacy, right? Who saw it as an illegitimate office in the church. And to a lesser extent, he's also defending against the Eastern Orthodox criticism of the papacy, but mostly against the Protestants. So when I read from the book, it's going to make references to John Calvin, who was a very large critic of the papacy, in the book. So Bellarmine is writing apologetically, which means a defense of the faith, against those who would argue against the papacy. And what he does is, in the book, in the very beginning of the book, he's arguing for the form of government of monarchy being the best of all the forms, right? So he establishes that first, and then he kind of crosses over ecclesiastically into the papacy. But for our episode here, we're just going to focus on the civil sphere for the most part. So with all of that being said, let's get into it, right? The best form of government, being the monarchy. Chapter 1 is called "The Question is Proposed: What Might Be the Best System of Government?" So these are the words of St. Robert Bellarmine, English translation. And this is not the Grant translation. This is, does it give the translation? Translated by, it is the Grant translation. Okay. So, quote, "There can be no doubt that our Savior, Jesus Christ, could and wished that his church should govern by that plan and mode that would be best and most useful. There are three forms of government: monarchy, that is the rule of the best, monarchy that is of one prince, the contrary vice to which is tyranny." Right. So Bellarmine's he's gonna give the positive aspect and then the negative aspect. Right. That's kind of in the Catholic world, in the moral theology, you'll have a virtue and then you'll have its corresponding vice, right? So you have the good part is the virtue and the negative part is the vice, or the sinful part, counterpart to the virtue. So he says monarchy is of one prince and the contrary vice to which is tyranny, right? So a bad monarch would be a tyrant. Second form of government would be aristocracy, that is the rule of the best men, plural, to which is opposed an oligarchy, right? So a bad aristocracy would be an oligarchy, a bad group of men governing, right? And then the third form being democracy, that is the rule by the whole people, which does not rarely fall into sedition, right? The chief philosophers teach this, namely Plato and Aristotle, and they do so for a good reason. For if the multitude must be governed, it cannot be done without being governed in some way according to those three modes. Either one is put in charge of the commonwealth, or some from many, or everyone altogether. If one, it will be a monarchy. If some from many, it will be an aristocracy. If altogether everyone, then a democracy. Moreover, although these three might only be simple forms of government, nevertheless they can be mixed among themselves, and from such a mixture 4 other forms of government are produced. One combined from all three, the second from monarchy and aristocracy, the third from monarchy and democracy, the last from democracy and aristocracy. That being so constituted, the first question arises, what might be the best form of government from those 7? Now, John Calvin, in order to altogether block every way in which one usually arrives by disputation to constitute ecclesiastical monarchy, places aristocracy and democracy before all other forms. So Calvin prefers aristocracy and democracy over all the others, right? An aristocracy from single forms, though in fact it is a mixed form, a government tempered according to his own mind. Most of all, he wished monarchy to be regarded as the worst of all, especially if it were constituted throughout the world or in the church. His words from the Institutes of the Christian Religion are these. So now he's quoting Calvin. Quote, should it be as they would have it, that it is good and also useful that the whole world be comprised by one monarchy, which is still very absurd, but should it be so still I would never concede that it should flourish in the government of the church, close quote. And again, Calvin says, quote, if in itself those 3 forms of government are considered which the philosophers posit, I myself can hardly deny either aristocracy or a form combined with popular government by far excels every form of the state. Thereafter he showed 2 arguments. One brought out of experience, the second from divine authority. Quote, it was always sanctioned by experience itself, not only because the Lord confirmed it by his authority, but even more, in that aristocracy is nearest to the form of government he established among the Israelites. Close quote. We, on the other hand, meaning Catholics, follow St. Thomas Aquinas and other Catholic theologians in that from the 3 simple forms of government we place monarchy before the rest. Although on account of the corruption of human nature, we reckon monarchy blended with aristocracy and democracy to be more useful for men in this time than a simple monarchy, provided the first parts should be of monarchy. It should have the second, aristocracy, and in the last place it should be democracy. So there you have it. According to Doctor of the Church, Saint Robert Bellarmine, and he's gleaning from St. Thomas Aquinas, another doctor of the church, monarchy is the number 1 best form of government, although it can be tempered with some checks and balances with an aristocracy and some forms of democracy, right? Will the people or a representation of the people. The second best form is an aristocracy. And the last of the big 3, the Catholic Church puts democracy at the lowest. And he'll explain why in a minute. Going back to Bellarmine. To be sure, in order that the whole matter can more easily be explained and confirmed by arguments, we will take up our teaching on the 3 propositions. The first proposition, among the simple forms, the most excellent is monarchy. Second, blended government, including all 3 forms, on account of the corruption of human nature, is more useful than simple monarchy. Thirdly, after we have excluded all other circumstances, simple monarchy simply and absolutely excels. So notice that he says, because of the corruption of human nature, it's more practical that a monarchy be blended with other forms. But ideally and logically, monarchy is the most excellent, right? All right, second chapter. The first proposition is proved that simple monarchy is superior to simple aristocracy and democracy. Quote, let us proceed from the first. We do not especially compare monarchy with mixed forms of government, nor do we place it before all mixed and simple forms. But we assert this. If some simple form of government must necessarily be chosen, without a doubt monarchy should be chosen. Now we will prove it by these arguments. Firstly, all the old Hebrew, Greek, and Latin writers, theologians, philosophers, orators, historians, and poets agree with this opinion. First, we look to Philo from the Jewish theologians, praising the teaching of Homer. Quote, that for many to command is evil. There should be one king, for rule pertains not to citizens and men more than to the world and to God. Close quote. Among the Greeks, Blessed Justin teaches that the rule of many is harmful, and on the contrary, the rule of one is more useful and beneficial. Quote, the rule of one is truly freed from wars and dissensions and is usually free, close quote. Also, St. Athanasius, quote, truly we have said that a multitude of gods is a nullity of gods, so also necessarily a multitude of princes makes it that there should appear to be no prince. However, where there is no prince, there is confusion, is absolutely born, close quote. So there you have it, St. Athanasius, right? Among the Latins, Saint Cyprian teaches the same thing, and he proves it most eminently from the very fact that monarchy should be the best and most natural government, because God is one. Quote, for the divine authority, let us borrow from an earthly example. In what way has an alliance of power ever begun with trust or ended without blood? Close quote. Saint Jerome says, quote, one emperor, one judge of the province. When Rome was built, she could not have two brothers as kings at the same time. Close quote. Lastly, one can consult St. Thomas. Now, from the philosophers, Plato says, quote, one dominion has been arranged for good laws. The law of these is best. That governance in which not many command, we ought to esteem as the middle. The administration of many others in all matters is weak and also frail. Close quote. Aristotle followed Plato, and after he enumerated these three forms of rule, he adds these words, quote, a kingdom is the best of these, a republic the worst, close quote. Seneca and that of Marcus Brutus did not act with sufficient prudence when he killed Julius Caesar in the hope of liberty, and giving the reason, he says, quote, since the best state of the citizenry is to be under one just king, close quote. Next, Plutarch wrote a whole work on monarchy and on the rest of the forms to rule the multitude, in which he expressed his opinion, quote, if the choice of electing were conceded, one should not choose anything else than the power of one, close quote. And again, Plutarch wrote the same thing on Solon of Athens, when he said that at Athens many seditions arose when democracy flourished, and immediately adds, one method, however, appeared to be left over to safety and quiet, if matters would have been brought to the rule of one, close quote. Notice the word one, because oneness is unity, and unity provides strength, right? When you have disunity, you have the fragmentation of a government, fragmentation of a nation, a fragmentation of a people, and then you have weakness and dissolution. And another country, another nation or an empire which does have unity will easily conquer the one that does not, right? That should go without saying. That's logical, and it's scriptural, it's biblical, right? St. Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 5, one Lord, one baptism, one faith, right? Not in that order. One faith, one baptism, one Lord. One, right? So you have oneness. Oneness is strength. Oneness is unity. Essential, right? Continuing with Bellarmine. Among orators, Socrates, in that oration which is entitled Nicocles, contends to show that this very thing for many reasons, but John Stobaeus marked it down in this title, Hoti kalis dion he novarkia, that's Greek, and also in that discourse of Hesiod, Euripides, Cyrenius, Ecphantus, and many others, he produces testimonies to confirm this very thing. Herodotus, in his Histories, Book 3, which is entitled Thalia, when he brought to light the slaughter of the Magi who had occupied the kingdom of Persia, also shows the disputation that was held among the princes on establishing a republic. He had departed from their disputation, and after shaking off the opinions of those who strove for aristocracy or a commonwealth by the consensus of all, with only one exception, monarchy was judged to be the most useful and excellent, and on the account it was retained in Persia. Thereupon, among the poets, Homer in Book 2 of the Iliad advanced that opinion celebrated by nearly all writers. Calvin responds to that testimony of Homer, which whose opinion alone among so many he objects to, saying, this is Calvin, quote, "It is easy to respond. Monarchy is not even praised in this sense either from the Homeric Ulysses or from others, as if one ought to rule the whole world by means of authority. But they wish to indicate that a kingdom cannot take two, and power, as he says, is an impatient consort." Quote. And certainly, if it was easy for Calvin to respond, it is easier for us to respond to Calvin. Us meaning Catholics. For either he says nothing, or he says what we say, or he speaks falsity and contradicts himself. If, when he says one kingdom cannot have two men, he means to place the force of the word kingdom, and means a kingdom properly so called cannot take two men, since if there were two, there would not be a kingdom properly so called, since a kingdom is properly the supreme power of one man. Then really he says nothing altogether, but only spreads darkness over the inexperienced by the ambiguity of words. For to say in that sense a kingdom does not take two means the same as if someone would say the rule of one is not the rule of two, and one man is not two men. Nothing in this pronouncement is due to the wisdom of Ulysses. Yet if he does not put the force on that word, but rather he understands by the kingdom of the multitude who should be ruled, then he says the very thing which we are saying. On this we assert that monarchy excels a commonwealth and aristocracy, because the multitude is not ruled by because the multitude is not ruled agreeably by many, and power is an impatient consort. Right. So what Bellarmine is saying here is that the multitude don't agree with each other, and you cannot have efficient governance, right? So back to Bellarmine. If therefore he means for a kingdom to be understood not as a multitude, but some individual province, or one scanty kingdom, that the sense might be that one king is to be given to one province. Nevertheless, he is not to be judge of the whole world. Then he speaks falsely and contradicts himself, for the Homeric Ulysses does not dispute over establishing a republic in some individual province. Rather, he spoke to the whole army of the Greeks, who were then fighting at Troy, in which army there were many nations, many princes, and many kings, and he affirmed it was not fitting for that the whole multitude to be ruled by many, but by one. Therefore, the sense of this famous passage can be none other than, in whichever individual multitude you like, there ought to be one primary ruler, because he holds place equally in a scanty kingdom and in the greatest command. For in one scanty kingdom there ought to be one king, not because it is scanty, but because it is one. For this reason, if some kingdom was great, as was Assyria, or that of Cyrus, or even of Alexander or Augustus, it was one. It ought to have one prince, and seeing that the church is one, there will be no end of his kingdom, and in the days of their kings the God of heaven will arouse, because he is not overthrown. On that account there even ought to be one king. Next, Calvin even opposes himself. Accordingly, not only does he consider that a monarchy over the whole world would not be advantageous, but not even over some individual city or the church, as is clearly gathered from Book 4 of the Institutes, where he bestows all ecclesiastical power upon a body of elders, and from the same book where he praises those cities which, having thrown off the yoke of princes, are governed by senate and people, as the Republic of Geneva. Therefore, since Calvin leaves no place for monarchy, he himself saw how well he ought to respond to so many and such serious authors who praise the opinion of Homer. Another reason is deduced from a divine authority, which shows in three ways that monarchy is the best system of government. The first, by the establishment of the human race. God made from one every kind of man, as the apostle says. Indeed, he did not produce both men and women equally from the ground, but man from the ground and woman from the man. Sorry, feminism. Showing the reason for this, St. John Chrysostom says that this is so that there should not be democracy among men, but a kingdom. Another saint, St. John Chrysostom, my patron saint. Right? And certainly, if many men were produced from the ground at the same time, they all would have been equally princes over their posterity. were that the case we could rightly doubt whether the rule of one pleased God. But now, since he made the whole human race from one, and he wished everyone to depend on one, clearly it appears to mean that the rule of one is commended more than the governments of many. Next, God showed his opinion not only when he inserted the natural propensity to monarchical rule among men, but even among nearly all things. There can be no doubt whether the natural propensity must be referred back to the author of nature. Moreover, he even declares that in some house, naturally the governance of the spouse, children, servants, and all other affairs naturally pertains to one head of the household. It is, before all other forms of government, the rule of one. In like manner, a great part of the world is governed by kings. Apart from that, monarchy is by far older than the system of republics. In the beginning, the rule of nations and empires was in the hands of kings. Therefore, it appears all living things aspire to the rule of one. Saint Cyprian speaks thus, quote, "There is one king for bees, one leader among flocks, and one rule among rams." Close quote. St. Jerome adds, quote, "And cranes follow one by the order of litter." Close quote. Calvin, however, mocks these testimonies, for Calvin says, quote, "On this matter, if it please God that they offer proofs from cranes and bees who always choose one leader for themselves, there cannot be many proofs. Rightly, I accept the testimony they give, but do bees from all over the world merely choose one king? And their beehives are contained individual kings, so also in cranes each flock has its own king. What else does this evince that to each church ought to be attributed its own bishop?" Close quote. This response from Calvin is easily refuted, says Bellarmine, for the church is as one sheepfold, John chapter 10. Not many sheepfolds. Thus it can also be called one beehive and one flock. And on that account, just as there is one king for bees, and cranes follow one in the rank of the litter, so the universal church, the Catholic Church, ought to have and follow one leader and primary teacher. Thereupon cranes and bees are not of that nature that they can unite when they are absent and placed far away from the union of spirit, and on that account it is little wonder that they do not flock together throughout the world to choose one king. And in this manner that each of their flocks have their own king shows clearly enough from that the government of one is natural. For if we evince from these examples brought from very authoritative fathers, as Calvin says that each church ought to be attributed its own bishop, why will he not suffer bishops except maybe in name only, but instead attributes all ecclesiastical power to the body of elders? So St. Robert Bellarmine is kind of revealing Calvin's inconsistency, or at worst, hypocrisy, where he says that a bishop ought to rule each individual parish, or you might say diocese, but he himself in Calvinist Geneva had a body of elders and not bishops, properly speaking, right? All of these aside, says Bellarmine, the form of rule which God himself wished to confirm by his authority can be gathered here chiefly from that state which he established among the people of the Hebrews. He did not, as Calvin says, but cannot prove, make the government of the Hebrews an aristocracy or a government of many, but was plainly a monarchy. The princes among Hebrews were first of all patriarchs, as Abraham, Jacob, Jude, and the rest. Thereupon generals, as Moses and Joshua. Then judges, as Samuel, Samson, and others. Afterwards kings, such as Saul, David, and Solomon. Thereafter again generals, as Zerubbabel and the Maccabees. Further, the deeds of the patriarchs show that they were provided with royal power. Abraham waged war against 4 kings, and we do not read anywhere that he received full power from any senate, nor any decree from such a body. Judah judged his daughter-in-law, who was accused of adultery, with fire, and he did not consult or ask any senate. Moses, as a true and supreme prince of the Jewish people, commanded many thousands of Jews to be killed on account of the golden calf, which they had erected one day. We do not read of any decree of a senate, or that of a plebiscite, plebiscite was held. The same thing could altogether be said of the judges, who received no faculty from a senate or from the people, and waged wars that they wished, and gave men over to be killed. Certainly Gideon, after the victory over the Midianites, killed 70 men in the city of Succoth and destroyed the tower of Phanuel. Next, over the fields and those who attended them, the leaders of the Jews were entrusted with a supreme and also a royal authority that is so clear that it is not necessary to prove. Therefore, it remains to be seen where Calvin read that the government of the Jews was by aristocrats and by the people, and not usually governed by any one particular prince. By chance, we will object that we have in one book of Kings, or Samuel, chapter 8, where the Israelites are reproved by God because they demanded a king. For if God was not pleased to establish a king for their government, how believable is it that generals and judges were established by God with royal power? We respond, someone can be put in charge of a state with supreme power in two ways. First, as a king and lord who depends on no one, and second, that for a king or primary general, someone is indeed in charge of the whole people, but who nevertheless is himself subject to a king. Therefore, God had in his second manner established the government of the Jews in the time of generals and judges, that he should, without any doubt, be the proper and particular king of that people, and nevertheless, because they were men and lacked a visible ruler, and one whom they could go to and appeal, he placed before them some man as for a king, who by no means depended upon the people, and who were subject to him, but upon the true king, God alone, right? So you had God, he would establish a judge or a general who was answerable to God himself. So kind of like in the Catholic Church, you have Jesus Christ as the head of the church, and the Pope is the vicar of Christ, or the visible head, right? The one who represents and is answerable to God, but nevertheless a monarch. Hence to Samuel, quote, they have not cast you off, but me, says the Lord, lest I should rule over them, close quote. And with the apostle, quote, Moses was faithful in the whole of his house as a slave, close quote. However, because the Jews were not content in this state of government, they wished to have a king in that prior manner, who not only should command all as one, but even make generals and judges, and even should possess the whole kingdom as his own, and transmit to his sons and grandsons the inheritance. On that account, they were rightly condemned and castigated by the Lord. Nor did that desire of having their own king so displease God that he commanded them to apply a rule by many, or to adapt to the spirit of aristocracy. Rather, he designated a king as best for them, and afterwards saved and protected both their king and their kingdom for a long time, until it remained as a duty. The last reason follows, which is deduced from the enumeration of those properties that everyone holds, makes the best government. In fact, that first property is order, right? In the very matter, it is a better government. It is because it has been more ordered. However, monarchy is more ordered than an aristocracy or a democracy. Thus, it can be proved, right? So that's kind of like the first, you could say the first political virtue is order. Order comes before liberty, because only out of order can you even enjoy liberty, right? So if your city is burning down because people are rioting, you cannot enjoy your liberty, right? So liberty does not come before order, and order is most efficiently established by monarchy. Should go without saying. All order has been placed in it, that some man should be in charge, others should be subject. Nor indeed is order recognized among equals, but rather among superiors and inferiors. Where there is monarchy, there are all things altogether have some order, when there might be no man who is not subjected to someone, excepting he who has care of all things. For this reason there is supreme order in the Catholic Church, where the people are subject to their pastors, pastors subject to bishops, bishops to metropolitans, metropolitans to primates, primates to the supreme pontiff, the supreme pontiff to God. But where governance is in the hands of aristocrats, indeed the people have their own order when they are subjected to aristocrats, but the aristocrats have none among themselves, right? Democracy lacks order in far greater degree, since all citizens are of the same condition, and they are all judged to be of authority in the commonwealth, right? Another property is the acquisition of its proper end. There cannot be any doubt whether that form of ruling the multitude would be better and more fittingly and easily acquires its proposed end. The end of government, however, is the unity of citizens among themselves and peace, which that union appears principally to be centered on all that might think the same, wish the same, and follow the same, right? So a nation having similar interests and, being of a similar people, they want peace, they want harmony, unity, and that comes best through monarchy, right? Back to Bellarmine. They will obtain it much more certainly and easily if one must be obeyed rather than many. For it can scarcely happen that many, of whom one does not depend on the other, might make judgments about matters in the same way. Therefore, when there are many who rule the multitude, then one or another commands something or will not suffer someone, in various pursuits, the people necessarily become divided, but this can scarcely happen when it is the duty of only one to command. Use confirms this same thing, and experience is the teacher of things. Accordingly, in ancient Rome under the kings, dissensions are rarely read among the citizens. After the kings were expelled, however, when a magistrate governed the republic for many years, it was a rare year in which the patricians did not contend with the plebeians, and at length they progressed even to civil strife, so that in a certain measure the most powerful republic perished at its own hands. It even happened that there was never a greater and longer peace enjoyed in the Roman state than under the Emperor Augustus, who established the first stable monarchy at Rome. The third property is strength and power of the state. That governance which in the judgment of all excels the rest is one which makes the state more powerful and stronger, a centralized state, right? It is a stronger state in which there is a greater peace and concord among the citizens. Indeed, the combined strength dissipated among them is itself stronger. But a greater unity is where all depend on one than where they depend on many. And was proved above, consequently, monarchy makes both a stronger state and is itself the best government. Experience agrees. Accordingly, from the four greatest empires, 3 rose under kings, obviously the Assyrians, the Persians, and the Greeks. The Roman Empire is the exception, which rose under popular domination, but even then they could not preserve it in great disturbances of affairs without a dictator, that is, a king established pro tempore. Afterwards it flourished under Augustus more than it had at any time under the Republic. The fourth property is stability and long duration. Certainly it cannot be denied that the government is better, which is more stable and long-lasting. But monarchy, not aristocracy or democracy, endure the longest. But if it is a question of external force, we already showed that without a doubt it is stronger than the rest. So it's easier to resist enemies under a monarchy than any other form of government. That's what he's saying. Now, it remains to be seen whether monarchy is less given to emergencies and change than any other form of government, with there being no external force applied. It is so proved. Quote, every kingdom divided against itself will be destroyed, close quote, as Christ says in the Gospel of St. Matthew. But it is more difficult for monarchy to be divided than any other form of rule. It is divided less easily because it is more one and unified. Though truly the monarchy is one in itself and naturally nothing other than one, still the multitude agreeing as one is only one form of its character. In itself it is many. Therefore monarchy which depends upon one man can be less easily torn asunder or destroyed than aristocracy or democracy which depend upon the multitude agreeing as one body. For example, the monarchy of the Assyrians from Ninus to Sardanaptum endured for 1,240 years without interruption, as Eusebius teaches in his Chronicle, or 1,300 years as Justin gathers in Book 1, or beyond 1,400 as Diodorus wishes us to believe. Thus, this kingdom so endured that there was always a son as successor of the dead king in the kingdom. If it is true what Velleius Paterculus wrote in the first volume of his history. But the kingdom of the Scythians, which is held to be the oldest of all, could not be destroyed by any external enemy, as Justin writes in Book 2, nor was it dissolved in itself at any time. For around thousands of years that kingdom stood. There is no republic which has ever lasted long-lived as a stable. Certainly the most powerful republic of the Romans could scarcely count 480 years, as many years from the expulsion of the kings even to the reign of Julius Caesar. But under the monarchs in the east, from Caesar even to the last Constantine, it endured 1,495 years without interruption. In the west, however, from the same Caesar even to Augustulus, around 500 years, and from Charlemagne even to the present emperor, it has been around 800 years. But for the 480 years that democracy flourished in the Roman Empire, the republic was not always ruled in the same manner. From the beginning, yearly consuls were created a little after they added tribunes. Then the consuls and tribunes were taken up, creating decemviri. After year, these were thrown out, and again the consuls and tribunes were recalled. Not rarely, even dictators, as many military tribunes were brought in with consular power. Therefore, no one form endured long, nor could they all reach the age of noble kingdoms altogether. Some by chance bring up the Venetian Republic, which counts about 1,010 years. Yet that has not even attained the years of the kingdom of the Scythians or the Assyrians. On the contrary, not even the kingdom of the Franks. And what is more, it is not a republic. Where aristocracy is mixed with rule of many, the form which Calvin praises, but an aristocracy mixed with monarchy. Democracy has never existed in that city of the Venetians. The fifth and last property is the facility of governance. Indeed, it relates more to whether it can be obtained easily and not with difficulty that the state should be well governed. That it is easier for the state to be ruled rightly by one rather than can be proved from these reasons. Number 1, it is easier to find one good man than many. Thereupon, it is easier for the people to obey one than many. On that account, magistracies, which take turns and govern a state for a short time, are often compelled first to lay aside a duty, then plainly recognize the business of the state. On the other hand, a king who always exercises the same office, even if from time to time he is of a meager intelligence, nevertheless, by use and also experience, it is better than many others. Number 2, in like manner, yearly magistrates look after a business of the state, which is not of their own, but common and foreign. A king does so properly in his own. It is certain that it is not only easier, but even more thorough for one to care for his own things than for others. Number 3, where there are many to rule, it can hardly be the case that there would be no rivalry, ambition, and contention present, and in point of fact, it does not rarely happen that some impede others, and affect that those who govern the affairs at hand will administer the commonwealth badly. In such a case, it is better for them to receive glory in abundance when they exercise the magistracy. But monarchy, which does not have anyone it might envy or with whom to contend in governance, more easily moderates all things. Lastly, to the extent that in great households, where many servants are assigned to the same duty, they manage their business badly because one shall leave behind a common duty to another. Or even where there are many heads of state, one looks to another while the other throws back the burden on his own colleagues. No one sufficiently employs diligent care to the state, but a king that knows all things depend upon himself alone is compelled to neglect nothing. And also hitherto it is indeed proven that simple monarchy is better by far than simple aristocracy. So there you have it. Then Bellarmine goes on to proceed to argue that monarchy mixed with aristocracy and democracy should be more advantageous in this life than a simple monarchy, and that without the circumstances of this world, simple monarchy would excel absolutely and simply. And goes on and on. But his arguments should suffice. That unity is strength, and efficient governance is actually better for the people. So if you have a good monarch recognizes that he is not himself God, right? But that he is answerable to God. And that also that he embraces tradition, right? A Catholic monarch understands that he is subject to the Pope, and he is also has the burden of holding fast to tradition, right? That which was handed down to him, right? So he's not like he's not an an autocrat, an absolute tyrant or an absolute autocrat. He doesn't just make things up ad hoc as he goes along. He has responsibilities to carry on the traditions, carry on the faith, right? And a good monarch also recognizes that all of his subjects are like all of his children, and it is his duty and responsibility to care for them and to look after them with justice, right? That's what a good monarch does. So all this idea, this no kings nonsense that people who advocate for democracy or even a republic in some sense, it's anti-Catholic. Now, if we look at the great revolutionaries of Europe, right? Like, for example, the Freemasons, they always sought to overthrow the monarchy as well as the authority of the church. So it all has to do with authority. People don't like to be ruled, right? It's like, you're not the boss of me philosophy, right? So the Freemasons and the revolutionaries always sought to overthrow the Catholic monarchs and ultimately the authority of the church and the Pope, right? So you have the French Revolution of 1789. They blamed King Louis XVI for all their problems, even though King Louis XVI bent over backwards to try to reason with them and to represent them. He went so far as to sign a constitutional monarchy, right? He signed a constitution and they still cut his head off. So it wasn't about him being a tyrannical king or that he was stealing food from the peasants and keeping it all for the nobles, as they accused him of. No, they were just, it was the Freemasons, spreading their propaganda against them because they wanted to overthrow the monarchy, right? And the same thing with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. They killed the Tsar and his families, betrayed them, because they hated Christianity and they hated monarchy, right? So monarchy is the best form of government if you are a Catholic, or even if you claim to be a traditional Christian of any sense, right? The people do not rule. The people, for the most part, as far as governing, are incompetent. I mean, just look at politics today. It's become ridiculous. It's become like American Idol in this country and other countries too. Whoever has the best sound bites, whoever is the smoothest talker, whoever has the best sounding rhetoric, and then rarely do they even, once they get your vote, rarely do they even deliver on their promises, right? You can look up some of the other videos I've done about current state of political affairs in America, right? Lots of betrayal, not only not fulfilling promises, but doing the opposite, right? So now the question, now that we have established from Catholic teaching authoritatively taught by doctors of the church, and it should be obvious from our Lord, Christ is king, and the Pope is a king. It should be obvious. So now, how do you get to a democratic republic like we have in America to a monarchy? Very good question. There are some middle grounds. There are some middle ways that you get there. It's like baby steps. Like, you're not going to go from a democratic republic that we have in America straight to a monarchy. I mean, without some miracle, right? It's not going to happen. There's going to have to be something chaotic is going to have to happen, right? I mean, you could have the power grid goes out and then it becomes chaos. And out of the chaos, like we said in the apocalyptic genre type of movies and shows, then people unite around a leader. That could happen. But without that happening, how do you get to a monarchy from where we're at now? That's a matter of controversy. There are some middle ways. Let's see. One way in Italy in the 1920s was called fascism. Benito Mussolini fathered the term, right? He proposed it, and I know that's like a bad F word to Americans. They hear fascism, they're like, "Oh no, not that." They see it as like a tyrannical dictatorship. But actually, the way Mussolini proposed it was that he kind of divided sectors of society, into trades or labor unions, you could say, and labor unions were oversaw by committees, and the committees were answered to the leader, right? So you had that. And then in Germany, the counterpart was National Socialism. And again, people hear that word and they cringe. But if you look at it from a philosophical point of view, both fascism and National Socialism were very much similar to how Catholic Christendom was ruled in the Middle Ages, right? So both of them were anti-capitalism, like the hoarding of wealth was always seen as something deplorable and something unethical and immoral, right? In the Middle Ages and during Catholic Christendom, if you were wealthy, you were expected to contribute to society with your wealth. You were expected to sponsor a knight in his training, or sponsor some noble's child in his education. You were expected to contribute to society in some way, and in return, you might get, your name was praised, right? It was patronage. You might even get a statue erected in your honor, right? So it was an exchange, an honor, but you were expected to contribute to society, right? So, and the same thing, was expected with National Socialism and with fascism, right? So, like Mussolini himself did not live in a mansion. He lived in a middle-class house. Some might even say meager, according to his state, right? So, in National Socialism, you have the exchange of services for the benefit of the whole of the people. But in order for you to have National Socialism, you actually have to have a nation, properly speaking, like a more or less a majority ethnic group. It doesn't have to be absolute ethnic group, but it has to be a majority, so you have a common stock, a common ideal, a common idea of what a nation should be, right? And a common idea of what the family should be. So you have an exchange of services, and the government serves the people, and the people serve the government. It's reciprocal. It's not, just one way, right? And, the idea of Catholic monarchy is the same way. So those are a couple of examples of middle ways of how to restore Catholic monarchy. I am a Catholic monarchist, right? I believe in monarchy, but I also believe that some of these middle ways are means to that end, right? And how that can happen is when people embrace tradition and they want to restore tradition over against democracy and liberal republics, or liberalism in general, against Freemasonry and all of the parts, and Marxism and everything which was constructed as an anti-monarchical form of government. It's when we have that mentality is when we can start to employ some of these middle ways. And I'm not saying that those are the only two middle ways. You can, achieve it baby steps. You can have some forms of republicanism as a third way also to eventually get to monarchy. Or even, a presidency or a prime minister can also function as a monarch, right? Even if you vote them in, but eventually we have to just be honest with ourselves and recognize that hierarchy is more according to nature than democracy, right? In the animal kingdom, the animals, the beasts of the field, do not elect a leader. A leader emerges because a leader is capable. A leader is competent. And in today's world, we see incompetency everywhere. We see instability everywhere. We see voters who think voting is like a high school popularity contest or American Idol. Dial 22202 for this leader. I mean, it's getting ridiculous like that. And we see fraudulent elections everywhere. We see corruption. So how do we fix this? How do we become more unified? Monarchy. How do we get a monarchy? Some kind of middle way. If you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comment. Like the video. Until then, I offer you a Roman salute. From the bottom of my Roman heart, nothing but love from the Empire. God bless.